October 23, 1942. The desert west of El Alamein, Egypt. Lieutenant Giuseppe Arcangli pressed his eye against the periscope of his Carro Armato M1340 medium tank, scanning the horizon through waves of heat rising from sand that had baked under the Mediterranean sun for 13 hours straight. The turret reeked of sweat, cordite residue, and diesel fumes that no ventilation system could fully purge. His loader, Corporal Benito Salvetti, sat wedged against the 47mm cannon, manually rotating rounds in their ready rack to keep the propellant casings from cooking in the brutal heat. Through the narrow slit of magnified glass, Arcangli saw them, silhouettes emerging from dust clouds raised by Montgomery's artillery barrage. Not the familiar profiles of British Crusaders or Matildas his crew had faced for 18 months. These were different. Taller, heavier, moving with a mechanical confidence that made his stomach tighten. American Sherman tanks. 252 of them had arrived in Egypt just weeks earlier, shipped directly from United States factories, still stamping serial numbers on turret plates. Italian intelligence had warned that these machines mounted 75mm guns. The reports hadn't explained what that meant in practical terms. Arcangli was about to learn. He would survive the next 11 days of fighting. Most of his regiment would not. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Lieutenant Arcangli didn't yet understand, what none of the Italian tank commanders positioned along the Axis defense lines comprehended, was that they were facing a fundamental technological mismatch that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The 47mm cannon in his turret, the same weapon equipping nearly every Italian medium tank in North Africa, was about to be revealed as catastrophically inadequate, not by design failure or manufacturing defect, but by simple, brutal mathematics, range, penetration. The calculus of armoured warfare that would doom the Italian armoured divisions to virtual annihilation over the following weeks. The story of how Italian tankers discovered the Sherman's overwhelming superiority didn't begin with captured vehicles or technical intelligence. It began with death. Sudden, inexplicable death coming from distances that Italian doctrine said were impossible for tank versus tank combat. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we must first understand what Italian tank crews believed about armoured warfare in October 1942. Their beliefs were not foolish or uninformed. They were based on 18 months of actual combat experience in North Africa. Experience that was about to become lethally obsolete in a matter of hours. The Carro Armato M1340 was Italy's most modern medium tank in frontline service. First deployed in 1940, it represented the best that Italian industry could produce under severe resource constraints. The Regio Esercito, the Royal Italian Army, classified it as a medium tank based on its intended role supporting infantry and engaging enemy armour. At 14.5 tons combat weight, it was actually lighter than most nations' light tanks. But classifications mattered less than capability. The tank carried a crew of 4. Commander and gunner shared the 2-man turret. Driver and hull machine gunner occupied the forward compartment. The riveted armour ranged from 6mm on the engine deck to 42mm on the frontal plates. That frontal armour was angled slightly, providing perhaps 50 to 55mm of effective thickness against projectiles striking at optimal angles. In 1940 and early 41, this protection was adequate. British 2-pounder guns, the standard armament on Crusader and early Matilda tanks, fired 40mm solid-shot projectiles. At combat ranges beyond 500 yards, the M1340's frontal armour could reliably deflect hits. Italian crews learned to angle their hulls, to use terrain, to engage at distances where their armour provided genuine protection. The 47mm Cannone da 47-32 Modello 35 formed the tank's primary armament. This was actually an Austrian-designed Berler anti-tank gun that Italy had licensed and produced domestically. As a towed anti-tank weapon, the 4732 performed adequately in its intended role. It could penetrate 43 millimeters of vertical armor plate at 550 yards. Against British cruiser tanks with thin armor, this was sufficient. Against the heavily armored Matilda infantry tanks, it was hopeless, but Italian doctrine called for using towed anti-tank guns and artillery against heavy tanks, not engaging them with medium tank guns. The gun's 32 caliber barrel length, meaning the barrel was 32 times the diameter of the bore, produced a muzzle velocity of approximately 630 meters per second. This velocity, combined with the 47mm armor-piercing projectile's mass, delivered adequate terminal ballistics against targets the gun was expected to engage. British light tanks. British cruiser tanks, soft-skinned vehicles. At ranges under 1,000 yards, Italian gunners achieved respectable hit probabilities. But the gun had a critical limitation that Italian crews understood well from painful experience. Effective anti-tank range was limited to approximately 500 to 600 yards. Beyond that distance, the projectile's velocity dropped off sharply. Penetration declined to levels where even lightly armored targets became difficult to defeat. Italian tank commanders learned through bitter experience at battles, like Badafom and Bir el Gubi, that engaging British armour at ranges exceeding 600 yards was futile. You closed the distance, you manoeuvred to flank positions, you coordinated with artillery and anti-tank guns. You absolutely did not attempt long-range gunnery duels. This tactical reality shaped Italian armoured doctrine throughout 1941 and 1942. Tank versus tank engagements were close-range affairs, 400 to 600 yards, sometimes closer. At these ranges, Italian crews could engage effectively. Their guns could penetrate. Their armour provided some protection. Training emphasized rapid closure, aggressive manoeuvre, and concentration of forces to achieve local superiority. The Carro Armato M1441, introduced in late 1941, addressed some of the M13's shortcomings. A more powerful diesel engine increased mobility slightly. Better air filters improved reliability in desert conditions. But the armament remained unchanged. The same 47mm gun. The same 500 to 600 yard effective range. Italian industry simply couldn't produce anything better within the time and resource constraints they faced. By October 1942, approximately 230 M13 and M14 tanks equipped the Italian armoured divisions defending the El Alamein line. The Ariete Division, the Littorio Division, and elements of the Centauro Division represented Italy's armoured strength in North Africa. These formations had fought continuously since June 1940. They'd gained hard-won experience. They'd developed tactics. They understood their equipment's capabilities and limitations. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand until they experienced it directly, was that the rules of armoured combat were about to change completely. The arrival of the Sherman tank represented a qualitative shift that Italian tactical doctrine had no framework to address. The M4 Sherman medium tank that Lieutenant Arcangli saw approaching through his periscope was the product of American mass production hitting its stride. The first production Shermans had rolled off assembly lines at Lima Locomotive Works in February 1942. By October, multiple factories were producing hundreds per month. The tank represented American industrial philosophy, prioritizing reliability, maintainability, and producibility over cutting-edge performance. At 33 tons combat weight, the Sherman was more than twice as heavy as the M1340. But weight alone didn't tell the story. The Sherman's armour scheme was fundamentally different. The glacis plate, the upper frontal armour, measured 56 millimeters thick and was angled at 56 degrees from vertical. This steep angle provided approximately 100 millimeters of effective thickness against projectiles striking head-on. The turret frontal armour measured 76 millimeters. Side armour ranged from 38 to 44 millimeters. Against the Italian 47mm gun, This armor was effectively invulnerable at any practical combat range. Italian armor-piercing shot could penetrate approximately 43 millimeters of vertical plate at 550 yards. Against the Sherman's angled glacis, providing 100 millimeters effective thickness, penetration was impossible. Even side shots at close range offered little hope. The 44 millimeter side armor, while technically within penetration range, was positioned at angles and often obscured by track assemblies, suspension components, and stowage. Italian crews who encountered Shermans in combat during October and November 1942 repeatedly reported the same experience. Hitting the Sherman wasn't difficult. The tank was tall, it had a high profile. Gunners could achieve hits at ranges where they'd successfully engaged British cruiser tanks. But hits didn't penetrate. Armor-piercing shot sparked off the glacis plate. Projectiles ricocheted off turret facets. The Sherman simply absorbed punishment that would have destroyed an M1340. But the true horror, the realization that transformed tactical disadvantage into strategic catastrophe, came from the other direction. The Sherman's main armament was the 75 mm M3 gun. This weapon was actually derived from the American M1918, a one-field gun, a World War I design that had been modernized and adapted for tank use. The 75 mm designation referred to the bore diameter. The barrel length was 37 calibers, giving it an L-37 designation in modern nomenclature. The M3 gun fired a 14.9-pound armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity of 594 meters per second. This velocity was actually slightly lower than the Italian 47 mm gun, but the projectile's significantly greater mass meant it carried far more kinetic energy. The M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round, the standard anti-tank ammunition, could penetrate 81 millimeters of vertical armor plate at 500 yards. At 1,000 yards, penetration dropped to 73 millimeters. Against the M1340's maximum armor thickness of 42 millimeters, the Sherman's gun was devastatingly effective. But the catastrophic disparity wasn't just about penetration. It was about range. Effective anti-tank range for the 75 mm M3 was approximately 1,500 to 2,000 yards, depending on target and ammunition type. At these distances, the Sherman could engage Italian tanks with confidence of penetration, while remaining completely immune to return fire. The implications were simple and absolute. Italian tanks had to close to within 500 yards to have any hope of penetrating a Sherman. But at 500 yards, the Sherman could already have fired multiple aimed shots, and closing that distance meant crossing 1,000 yards of open desert under accurate 75 mm fire. The mathematics were brutal. An Italian tank attempting to close from 1,500 yards to 500 yards needed to cover 1,000 yards of ground. The M1340's maximum road speed was 32 kilometers per hour. Approximately 20 miles per hour. Cross-country speed over desert terrain averaged perhaps half that. 10 miles per hour equals about 15 feet per second. 1,000 yards equals 3,000 feet. 200 seconds of exposure time, minimum, more than 3 minutes. A well-trained Sherman crew could fire approximately 6 aimed rounds per minute. In 3 minutes of approach time, assuming the Italian tank wasn't obscured by terrain or concealment, the Sherman could fire 18 rounds. Combat reports from El Alamein indicated average accuracy of approximately 30 to 40% for moving targets at ranges between 1,000 and 1,500 yards. That meant 6 to 7 hits during the approach. Any single hit that penetrated would likely destroy the Italian tank or kill crew members. Even if the Italian tank survived the approach and reached effective range, it still faced an opponent with superior armor. Achieving penetration required side or rear shots. But the Sherman's gyro stabilizer, a powered mechanism that kept the gun relatively steady even when the tank was moving, meant the Sherman crew could continue firing accurately while maneuvering. The Italian tank had no stabilization. The gunner lost his sight picture every time the tank hit uneven ground. Lieutenant Arkangli didn't know these statistics on October 23rd. He knew his 47mm gun. He knew the ranges at which he'd successfully engaged British tanks. He knew his armour could withstand 2-pounder fire at moderate range. He had in no frame of reference for what was about to happen. The British artillery barrage that opened the Battle of El Alamein at 21:40 hours on October 23, 1942, was the largest concentrated bombardment the Western Desert had ever experienced. 900 artillery pieces fired for 5.5 hours, expending hundreds of thousands of rounds. The objective wasn't just to kill Axis troops. It was to suppress defensive positions, destroy communications, and most critically, blow lanes through the extensive minefields protecting the Axis lines. Italian tank units sheltered in hull-down positions during the barrage, engines shut down to conserve fuel that was already desperately scarce. The Ariete Division occupied positions south of the main British thrust. The Littorio Division held ground further north. Both formations were dispersed, their tanks dug into shallow revetments scraped from hard desert pan by bulldozers and hand labour. The revetments provided concealment and some protection from artillery airbursts. They would prove useless against direct-fire tank guns. When the artillery barrage lifted at 0200 hours on October 24th, British infantry and engineer units pushed forward through marked lanes in the minefields. Behind them came the armour, not immediately, not in the first hours, but as dawn approached and the infantry secured initial objectives, the tanks moved forward to exploit and expand the penetration. Arkangli's company received its first contact report at approximately 0700 hours, British armour advancing from the northeast. Range approximately 3,000 yards. The early morning sun was behind the British tanks, making observation difficult through crude Italian optics. The company commander ordered the M1340s to start engines and prepare to manoeuvre. Standard doctrine. Allow the British to close to effective range, then counterattack from flank positions, using speed and coordination. But as the range closed to 2,000 yards, something was wrong. British tanks weren't just advancing, they were firing, and hits were landing. Arkangli watched through his periscope as geysers of sand erupted around Italian positions. A shell struck the revetment wall 15 yards to his left, showering his tank with rock fragments and dust. That was impossible. British tanks didn't engage at 2,000 yards. Their guns couldn't achieve kills at that range. Everyone knew this. Then the first Italian tank died. A company mate positioned 200 yards to Arkangli's right. The M1441 took a hit in the right side of the hull, penetrating just below the turret ring. The tank didn't explode. It simply stopped. White smoke poured from the engine deck. The crew bailed out, running away from the disabled vehicle. They'd covered maybe 50 yards when a second hit struck the tank's turret. This time it did explode, ammunition cooking off in a pillar of flame and black smoke. Arkangli's company commander ordered the counterattack. 12 M1340s lurched forward from their revetments, accelerating across the open ground. The plan was simple: close to 500 yards, use speed and manoeuvre to complicate the British gunners' aim, return fire once in effective range, overwhelm the British tanks through concentration of force. They made it approximately 400 yards before the first of Arkangli's company died. The tank to his immediate left took a direct hit through the glacis plate, the frontal armour that was supposed to provide protection. The projectile penetrated completely, exited through the engine compartment, and detonated the fuel tank. The Carro Armato M1340 ran on diesel fuel, which was supposedly safer than gasoline. The tank became a fireball anyway. No crew members escaped. At 1,200 yards range, Arkangli's gunner, Sergeant Emilio Cardini, screamed that he had a target. Cardini traversed the turret manually, cranking the hand wheel with desperate speed. He'd been a tank gunner for 2 years. He knew his sights, he knew his gun. He fired. The 47mm cannon cracked. The breech recoiled. The loader immediately rammed another round. Cardini fired again, and again. Arcangli pressed his face against the commander's periscope, trying to observe fall of shot. He saw nothing. No hits, no impact sparks. Perhaps the rounds were falling short. Perhaps they were missing high. At 1,200 yards, Italian guns weren't expected to achieve hits on moving targets. But the alternative was incomprehensible. At 1,000 yards, another company mate took a hit. The shell penetrated the turret, killing the gunner and commander instantly. The driver somehow managed to throw the tank into reverse, pulling back toward Italian lines with black smoke pouring from the open turret hatches. He made it perhaps 100 yards before a second hit stopped the tank permanently. At 900 yards, Arcangli's tank was hit for the first time. The projectile struck the glacis plate, the frontal armor, at a slight angle. The armor-piercing shot didn't penetrate, but the impact was violent enough to stun the crew. Arcangli's head slammed against the periscope housing. Blood ran from his nose. His ears rang. Through watering eyes, he saw Cardini frantically traversing the turret, searching for the tank that had just tried to kill them. They were going to die. Arcangli understood this with sudden clarity. They were going to die because someone had changed the rules, and nobody had told them. The company commander's tank took 3 hits in rapid succession. All 3 penetrated. The tank exploded so violently that the turret separated from the hull and landed 15 yards away. Arcangli could see the company commander's body, or what remained of it, still strapped into the commander's seat inside the overturned turret. 700 yards. Cardini was firing continuously now, as fast as Salvetti could load. The 47mm shells were finally having some effect, but not on tanks. Cardini was shooting at everything. Anything. A British supply truck behind the tanks caught fire. That was something. It was meaningless, but it was something. At 600 yards, Arcangli realized with horror that the British tanks were Shermans. The high silhouette, the 75mm gun barrel, the rounded turret. These weren't Crusaders. These weren't tanks his company could fight. And 600 yards was close enough that the Sherman crews could see Italian shot bouncing off their armour. Several British tanks were scarred with impact marks where projectiles had struck and failed to penetrate. The Sherman crews kept firing. At 500 yards, point-blank range for Italian guns, Cardini finally achieved a penetrating hit. His target was a Sherman that had turned broadside while firing at another Italian tank. The shot struck the right side of the hull, below the turret, penetrating the 38mm side armour. The Sherman lurched to a stop. Black smoke poured from the engine deck. The turret hatch opened. American crew members bailed out. This was the closest any of Arcangli's surviving company mates had gotten to killing a Sherman, 500 yards. Shooting the side armour. Even then, the crew escaped. Meanwhile, 8 of his company's 12 tanks were burning wrecks scattered across 600 yards of desert. The 4 survivors, including Arcangli's tank, were already reversing at maximum speed, trying desperately to break contact before the Shermans closed to ranges where side shots became easy. They made it. Barely. Arcangli's tank threw a track 200 yards behind Italian lines, possibly from damage caused by the hit they'd taken. The other 3 survivors took up hull-down positions in a small wadi, hoping concealment would protect them where armour couldn't. The battle continued for another 10 days. By November 4th, when the Africa Corps began its retreat westward, the Italian Ariete Division had ceased to exist as a combat formation. Of approximately 230 Italian medium tanks that had defended El Alamein on October 23rd, fewer than 40 remained operational by November 4th. Most had been destroyed. Many had been abandoned when fuel ran out, or mechanical failures made recovery impossible. The British had lost tanks too. But British losses came primarily from German 88mm anti-aircraft guns used in anti-tank roles, German long-barreled 50mm and 75mm tank guns, and mines. British Sherman losses to Italian 47mm tank guns were negligible. So negligible that many British after-action reports didn't even mention Italian tanks as a significant threat. Italian commanders who survived the battle filed desperate reports back to Comando Supremo in Rome. The reports described a situation that sounded impossible to staff officers who hadn't witnessed the fighting. Italian medium tanks were completely outclassed, outranged, out-armored, outgunned. Tank versus tank combat against Shermans was effectively suicide. The 47mm gun couldn't engage at ranges where the Sherman was vulnerable. The M1340's armour couldn't withstand 75mm fire at any range. Lieutenant Arcangli survived El Alamein. His tank did not. After throwing the track, the crew abandoned it and withdrew on foot. He fought through the remainder of the North African campaign, eventually commanding a platoon of captured British Valentine tanks that the Germans had turned over to Italian forces. He survived the war. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, he stated flatly that encountering Shermans at El Alamein was when he first truly understood that Italy was going to lose the war. Not because Italian tankers lacked courage or skill, because Italian industry had given them weapons that couldn't compete with what their enemies fielded. But the story of Italian tankers discovering the Sherman's superiority didn't end at El Alamein. It continued through the retreat across Libya, through the desperate fighting in Tunisia, and ultimately, through the few instances where Axis forces actually captured intact Sherman tanks and could examine them closely. Those examinations confirmed what Italian crews already knew from brutal experience, and they revealed specific details about the Sherman's design and capabilities that explained why the technological gap was so catastrophic. The retreat westward from El Alamein became a nightmare of mechanical breakdown and fuel shortage. Italian M1340s and M1441s, already mechanically stressed from months of desert combat, began failing at catastrophic rates. Unlike German units that could prioritize fuel allocation for their own vehicles, Italian formations received whatever the Germans couldn't use. Tank after tank ran dry and had to be abandoned. Others threw tracks on the rough roads and couldn't be recovered. By the time Italian forces reached defensive positions in western Libya, the Ariete Division could muster fewer than 30 operational tanks. The Littorio Division was in similar condition. The combined Italian armoured strength that had numbered over 200 tanks at El Alamein had been reduced to a fraction through combat, breakdown, and abandonment. British pursuit was relentless. Montgomery's 8th Army, now thoroughly confident in its Sherman-equipped tank brigades, pressed westward with aggressive reconnaissance and rapid pursuit operations. Italian rearguards fought desperate delaying actions, but engagement after engagement demonstrated the same brutal reality. Italian tanks simply couldn't compete. The Shermans engaged from ranges where Italian guns were ineffective, and when Italian tanks attempted to close distance, the Sherman's gyro stabilizer allowed them to fire accurately even while maneuvering, while Italian gunners lost their sight picture every time their tanks hit rough ground. On January 23, 1943, British forces captured Tripoli, the last major port in Italian Libya. The Afrika Korps and its Italian allied forces continued retreating into Tunisia, where the situation became even more complicated. American forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch in November 1942. Now Axis forces faced threats from both east and west. The British 8th Army advancing from Libya, American and British First Army forces pushing from Algeria. Axis forces were being compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket in northern Tunisia. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in mid-February 1943 gave Axis forces a brief tactical victory. German armour, using superior tactics and terrain, inflicted heavy casualties on inexperienced American forces. 46 of 52 American Sherman tanks from Combat Command C of the 1st Armoured Division were destroyed or abandoned during a poorly executed counterattack on February 15th. But the American losses came primarily from German long-barreled 50mm and 75mm guns, not from Italian weapons. And critically, Many of those destroyed Shermans were subsequently captured intact by Axis forces and shipped to testing facilities in Germany and Italy. This was where Italian technical officers finally got their hands on intact Sherman tanks for detailed examination. Several Shermans captured at Kasserine Pass and at Sidi Bou Zid were transported to Axis-controlled facilities. One early production, M4A1, designated War Daddy 2 by its American crew, was captured from the 1st Armoured Regiment and shipped to the German testing facility at Kummersdorf for comprehensive evaluation. Italian liaison officers attended these tests, desperate for information that might explain the catastrophic defeats they'd experienced. The German technical reports from Kummersdorf painted a picture that validated everything Italian tankers had learned through bitter experience. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun was examined in detail. Penetration testing against captured German and Italian armor plates confirmed the weapon's devastating effectiveness. At 1,000 yards, the standard M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round could reliably penetrate 81mm of vertical armor plate. At 1,500 yards, penetration was still approximately 73mm. These figures were obtained through actual firing tests, not theoretical calculations. Italian technical officers watching these tests understood immediately what the numbers meant. The M1340's maximum armor thickness of 42mm on the frontal glacis provided no protection whatsoever at any combat range. The Sherman could penetrate Italian tank armor at distances exceeding 2,000 yards if visibility permitted target acquisition. And the Sherman's frontal armor, with its steeply angled glacis providing approximately 100mm of effective thickness, was completely immune to the Italian 47mm gun at all practical ranges. The German report in the military journal Die Wehrmacht concluded with grudging respect. The preliminary investigation on Tunisian soil already showed that this rolling steel mine is not in itself a bad creation. This was remarkable restraint from a German military establishment that generally dismissed Allied equipment as inferior. The report detailed Sherman's advantages methodically. Reliable mechanical systems, good ergonomics for crew efficiency, excellent visibility for the commander, the gyro stabilizer that allowed firing while moving, wet ammunition storage that reduced fire risk after penetration. But the Italian observers focused on different aspects. They examined the turret traverse mechanism, finding it was powered by hydraulics with manual backup. Italian tanks used purely manual traverse, requiring significant physical effort from the gunner. They studied the gun sight, discovering it provided significantly better magnification and field of view than Italian optics. They measured armor thickness at multiple points, confirming that even the Sherman side armor, at 38 to 44mm, was essentially immune to Italian 47mm fire, except at point-blank range under ideal conditions. The most damning revelation came from range estimation exercises. German and Italian officers used the Sherman's sighting equipment to acquire and track moving targets at various distances. The Sherman's optics and sighting system allowed accurate range estimation and target engagement out to approximately 1,800 yards. Italian tank sights, designed for shorter engagement ranges, became effectively useless beyond 1,000 yards due to poor magnification and limited reticle design. Italian gunners literally couldn't see well enough to engage effectively at the ranges where Sherman crews operated routinely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Italian commanders filed desperate reports to Comando Supremo in Rome detailing the hopeless situation. Colonel Vittorio Sava, who commanded a battalion of the Ariete Division's remnants, wrote in March 1943, "Our tanks cannot engage the Sherman at distances where we have any prospect of success. To penetrate, we must close to ranges where their superior armor, superior optics, and stabilized guns give them overwhelming advantage. We are asking crews to commit suicide." The Italian military establishment tried desperately to develop solutions. The semovente da 75-18 self-propelled gun, mounting a 75mm gun on a modified tank chassis, entered production in early 1943. This vehicle could at least fire a projectile capable of damaging Allied armour, but it was an assault gun with limited traverse, not a tank, and Italian industry couldn't produce them in quantities sufficient to replace the hundreds of obsolete M13 and M14 tanks still in service. The Carro Armato P40 heavy tank project, intended to mount a 75mm gun in a fully rotating turret with armour thick enough to withstand Allied weapons, remained mired in development problems. Prototypes were built, tests were conducted, but production facilities were bombed by Allied aircraft. Critical materials became unavailable. The design required specialized components the Italian industry couldn't manufacture. The P40 never entered combat. By May 1943, the Tunisia campaign ended in complete Axis defeat. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. Among them were the remnants of Italian armoured divisions that had fought since 1940. The Ariete Division, which had fought with distinction at Bir Hachaim and El Alamein, ceased to exist as a military formation. Most of its few remaining tanks had been destroyed or abandoned during the final weeks of fighting. The crews who survived became prisoners of war, their testimony providing Allied intelligence officers with detailed information about Italian tank capabilities and morale. American interrogators specifically questioned Italian tank crews about their experiences fighting Shermans. The reports compiled from these interrogations revealed a consistent pattern. Italian crews universally expressed respect for the Shermans' capabilities. They acknowledged that attempting to engage Shermans at any range beyond 500 yards was futile. Several prisoners independently estimated that Italian tanks needed to achieve complete surprise and close to within 300 yards to have any realistic chance of achieving kills through side shots. One captured Italian lieutenant stated flatly, "Fighting a Sherman in an M1340 is not combat, it is execution. The only question is whether the crew can bail out before they burn." The Allied victory in North Africa eliminated Italian armoured forces as an effective fighting formation. The few Italian tanks that fought subsequently in Sicily and mainland Italy during 1943 and 44 were obsolete machines, manned by increasingly poorly trained crews, facing overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers, quality, and supporting arms. The Italian 47mm gun that had seemed adequate in 1940 against lightly armoured British cruiser tanks had been rendered completely obsolete by 1942. But Italian industry lacked the resources, the technology, and increasingly the time to develop and produce modern replacements. The Sherman tank's dominance over Italian armour wasn't primarily about advanced technology or revolutionary design. It was about fundamental engineering competence applied systematically. The 75mm gun was a World War I design, modernized but not revolutionary. The armour scheme was conventional. The mechanical systems were reliable but not sophisticated. What made the Sherman devastating against Italian tanks was simply that it represented 1942 industrial capability, while Italian tanks represented 1938 thinking built with 1935. Technology under 1943 resource constraints, the range disparity, the 1,000 yards of desert where Shermans could kill but Italian guns couldn't penetrate, became a metaphor for the entire technological and industrial gap between the Allies and the Axis. Italian tankers understood this gap viscerally. They'd experienced it in the most direct way possible, watching friends burn in tanks that couldn't fight back. The captured Shermans examined in Tunisia simply confirmed with engineering precision what every Italian tank crew already knew from brutal experience. They were hopelessly outclassed, and there was nothing courage or tactical skill could do to overcome the fundamental disparity in equipment capability. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.